Dark Paradise Minisode, Episode 1. Die-hard Dark Shadows fans know Dan Curtis borrowed from many classic works of literature, the gothic romance of Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, to more supernatural works like Dracula, Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and of course my personal favorite, The Turn of the Screw. My introduction to the actual story of The Turn of the Screw was when I was watching this televised movie back in 1995 called The Haunting of Helen Walker. Of course, I had no idea I was watching a version of The Turn of the Screw, but it had all of those familiar elements: the governess attending to the troubled but gifted children, the large isolated country estate, the housekeeper, and of course the two deceased servants who may or may not be possessing the children. I think I took to this story because I could identify with it in some way. When I was a child, I think I may have seen a ghost. But now as an adult, I'm not really certain now if I did or not. I was about 7 or 8, living in an apartment building built in the 1960s. My mom had asked me to go into her room to get something, and for some reason, there was a folding chair unfolded in there. And that's when I saw him. It was quite eerie. Especially now, since I'm pretty sure he resembled a Peter Quint or Quentin Collins type person in his physical appearance. He had the long sideburns and everything. I don't remember his clothes, but I do remember his face, and it kind of looked like Quentin or Peter Quint. And the ironic thing is, I hadn't heard of Turn of the Screw at this point in time. I stared at him for maybe a minute, and he didn't look translucent at all. He just looked like a regular person. So of course I freaked out, ran to get my mom, for the same reason that the child in the beginning of the Turn of the Screw novella wakes up his mother, not simply to witness the thing, but to confirm that it was truly happening. So we get to the room, and of course it's not there anymore, whatever it was that I saw, and I can't be certain that I saw anything at all, especially since that was the only time that I saw this thing. But you could argue that's one of the reasons I always enjoyed this story, especially in Dark Shadows. I think Dan Curtis was concerned his vampire protagonist would get stale, and that's why he borrowed from this classic story by Henry James. You've got Maggie Evans as the governess, already vulnerable because her father had just died, now thrust into this position to take care of David and his little friend Amy Jennings. What was incredibly eerie was that first episode when Amy picks up the phone and is clearly communicating with someone not of this world. And then we have the rest of our players, Mrs. Johnson filling in for Mrs. Gross, the housekeeper in the story, David and his Miles counterpart, and Quentin Collins and Beth Chavez, making for a really intriguing storyline that does head into a different direction. Killing a child within a soap opera back then was an absolute no-no, and so 1897 was born when we get to see another version origin story, never even addressed by Henry James. Now, I know many of you may disagree with me on this next point, but I think it would have made a lot more sense to send Maggie Evans back in time, since she's the governess and her role in this storyline and the original novella was to save the children. This would have given Maggie more to do and perhaps given her a more assertive role within Dark Shadows. Or even Roger Collins, considering he's David's dad. And while you can argue that it made sense to send Barnabas back given that he had his own body back there, he took a big risk. Given that he was just waiting around for somebody to free him from his coffin again. Doesn't it make more sense that somebody would have found his coffin back in 1795 after he was first buried? But I digress. Dan Curtis loved The Turn of the Screw so much that you could say he recycled his own borrowed storyline with Gerard Stiles and Daphne Harridge. Now, a lot of fans don't really like that storyline because they do feel it's a recycle. And in many aspects it is. But I think Dan just wanted to repeat it because he just enjoyed the success of that storyline, and I think he just wanted to see if lightning would strike in a bottle twice. He also loved it so much that he created his own film version for TV in 1974. One of my favorite stories about this is in this interview, Dan Curtis was explaining how he hired Meigs Jenkins, who portrayed Mrs. Gross in the 1961 film The Innocents with Deborah Kerr, and Meigs played Mrs. Gross back then, and I can't remember now if she just showed up for an audition or he called her personally because he couldn't think of any other person, he couldn't think of anyone else that could portray this character as well as she did in that film. And sure enough, she took the role. I feel like Meigs was the only one who truly understood her role, and I was kind of disappointed to find out that Mark Lester, who Dan Curtis originally hired to play Miles, didn't work out for some reason. You'll probably remember Mark Lester from Oliver, who played the title character. He also was in Who Slew Auntie Roo with Shelley Winters, and Mark really convinced me that he could be Miles because of his role in that film. The Turn of the Screw is one of those subjects I could sit and ramble on about for hours, but I am calling this a minisode. I will conclude this by just saying, if you haven't already checked it out, Soul Twin Audio's My Audio Drama Company has produced my own adaptation of The Turn of the Screw, starring the brilliant Tanya Rich as the governess and Fiona Mackinnon as Mrs. Gross. I'll provide a link for that in the show notes in case you want to listen to it. Stay tuned for next week when I discuss my thoughts on Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.